What if the man quietly sitting in first class, the one ignored, dismissed, and told he didn't belong, turned out to own the very airline flying the plane? What happens when silence isn't weakness, but strategy? This is a story about power, dignity, and a quiet revolution at 30,000 feet. Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The airport always had that mix of energy, somewhere between anticipation and exhaustion. Malric Dorsey stepped through the glass doors of Granville International in Atlanta like a man who had done it all before. And he had. Still, today felt different. He moved with quiet certainty, carrying a worn leather satchel over one shoulder. His blazer hung loosely over a navy sweater. Nothing fancy, just clean and deliberate. He didn't walk like a man trying to prove something, more like someone who had nothing left to prove. Yet in his chest, something stirred, like an old song you can't quite forget. At the check-in for first class, the agent gave him a professional nod, but avoided eye contact just enough for Malric to notice. Nothing new. He'd been looked past, looked through, and looked over for decades. This wasn't surprising, but today he was taking mental notes. His ticket read Solaris Air, Flight 307 to New York. Officially, he was just another passenger, seat 3A. Unofficially, he owned 41% of the airline. The lobby bustled with travelers, suits on phones, retirees wrangling roller bags, young people in sweats and earbuds. Malric kept to himself, settling into the first-class lounge like he belonged there. Because he did. That didn't stop the glances, though. A man in a gray suit, early 50s, stepped beside him at the coffee bar and asked, "You with cleaning?" Just like that. No malice. Just that casual, clumsy assumption. Malric didn't flinch. He gave the man a polite smile and replied, "Nah, just passing through." Then he picked up a bottle of water and walked away, leaving the man blinking after him. He took a seat near the window, watching the runway. Planes lined up, lifting into the overcast sky, one after another. He sent a short message to Alden Reeves. "Boarding now. Let's see how deep it goes." Alden had pushed for this, convinced Malric to go anonymous, to see the culture from the inside. "If you want real change," he'd said, "you have to know what it's like when they don't know who you are." When boarding was called, Malric stood, folded his jacket neatly over one arm, and made his way to the gate. Nobody rushed, nobody fussed. He was invisible in all the usual ways. Inside the aircraft, the leather seats gleamed. Cool lighting hummed overhead. A woman in a smart uniform, white blouse, navy scarf, stood at the front of the cabin. She was the kind of woman who'd spent years building a tone that could dismiss you without raising her voice. "Good afternoon," Malric said with a nod as he stepped into the first-class cabin. She looked at him, not through him, at him, but it wasn't curiosity, it was calculation, like a checker deciding if a piece belonged on the board. After placing his bag under the seat and settling in, he waited a moment before pressing the service button. The woman returned, hands behind her back. "Would it be possible to get a glass of water once we're in the air?" he asked, tone even, polite. She didn't blink. "This isn't coach," she said, flat and cool. "Not everyone gets to be served just because they ask." There it was. Not shouted, not cruel, but it landed just the same. Malric didn't respond. Not with words. His fingers moved quietly to his phone, tapping a short message. No emotion on his face, no rise in his chest. Just, "She's the one." Initiate. 2 rows ahead, a couple exchanged confused glances. A businessman across the aisle raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Cynthia Greaves, the flight lead, turned and walked back toward the galley like nothing had happened. Outside, the last of the luggage was being loaded. Inside, Malric sat with his hands folded, eyes on the window, watching the blur of lights shift against the clouds. He thought about silence. How many times it had protected him, how many times it had betrayed him, and how sometimes it could be the sharpest blade in the room. This wasn't about water. It never was. He could feel the pressure begin to shift, not in the cabin, but in himself. Malric kept his eyes on the window long after the plane began taxiing. The world outside looked gray and a little restless, just like the thoughts pacing in his head. His fingers rested loosely on the armrest, but the quiet grip of his right hand tightened, then relaxed. No one could tell, but inside he was sorting through a whole lifetime of restraint. He didn't expect kindness. He wasn't surprised by the cold shoulder or the backhanded tone, but it still hit, even when it wasn't supposed to anymore. That woman, Cynthia, her voice, her look, the way she assumed who he was and what he deserved, it stuck to the ribs, like something sour you couldn't wash down. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a slim phone. One message had already been sent, but he added another, this one to Alden. Watch for the report. Manifest says enough. The plane lifted off, pressing lightly against his chest. Malric glanced down the aisle. Cynthia was making rounds, moving with that sharp efficiency built over years of repetition. She handed out towels, nodded briefly, and skipped over him without a word, not even a glance. He wasn't surprised. The last time something like this happened, it was 2003, Chicago. He'd been flying for business, wearing a navy pinstripe suit that still smelled like starch. That day, the flight attendant had asked him, twice, if he was in the wrong seat. She didn't ask anyone else. He hadn't said a word then either. But back then, he didn't have the weight behind his silence. Back then, he was just another black man in a good suit, quietly collecting offenses like bruises he couldn't show. Now he owned nearly half of the company flying him. A soft chime broke his thought. Someone pressed the call button. Not him. Across the aisle, an older gentleman with silver hair motioned toward the galley. Cynthia nodded politely and brought him a sparkling water with a lemon wedge. A moment later, a younger white woman asked for headphones. Cynthia smiled and walked off to grab them. Malric blinked once. No resentment in his eyes, just clarity. The phone buzzed. Message from Alden. GA81 tracking initiated. Team log behavior tags. No anomalies outside row 3. Malric typed slowly. Keep it running. Don't intervene. 2 rows behind him, a soft voice spoke up. That guy never got his drink. He turned slightly. A woman, maybe in her early 60s, whispered to her seatmate while glancing in his direction. Her voice wasn't angry, more confused than anything else, as if trying to understand the rules she never realized were even there. She asked for something, the woman added, and got it right away. But when he asked, nothing. Her companion murmured something back, and they both turned their faces toward the window. The air in the cabin wasn't tense, not yet, but it was shifting, like something unspoken had started leaking into the space between the seats. A sense that maybe someone had noticed what they weren't supposed to. From the back of the cabin, a man in a tailored Navy suit walked forward. Alden Reeves. He looked like a regular executive to most, but to Malric, he was a mirror, a reminder of what they'd talked about for years. Change didn't come from titles or speeches. It came from moments. Alden stopped beside Malric's seat, leaned in just enough to keep it discreet and said, "You still good?" Malric nodded. Just watching the machine run itself. Alden tapped twice on the headrest, then walked toward the lavatory. On his way, he handed a bottle of water, room temperature, to Malric. No fanfare. Just a quiet correction to a wrong that should never have happened. Cynthia caught the handoff. She paused, eyes narrowing, lips parting like she might say something, but didn't. Her gaze lingered longer this time, but not with recognition, with unease. Malric cracked the cap and took a slow sip. He didn't need her apology. He didn't even need her acknowledgement. What mattered was the mirror, and whether she'd ever look into it. As he rested the bottle on the tray, he felt it. That old ache in the chest. Not pain, not rage. Something deeper. This wasn't about being thirsty. This was about how easy it was for people to deny someone water and still believe they were doing nothing wrong. The hum of the aircraft filled the silence between rows. Malric sat still, hands folded, his face unreadable. From the outside, he looked calm, maybe even indifferent. But inside, the tightness in his chest had begun to build. Cynthia moved past him again, this time distributing snack trays. Almonds, a small fruit cup, napkin folded into a perfect triangle. She didn't even glance at his row. Not a flicker of acknowledgement. It was intentional now, measured and deliberate. He pressed the call button. She stopped at the row ahead, dropped a tray, then turned her head slightly, pretending not to see the soft orange glow overhead. She kept walking, eyes on a clipboard, pretending she didn't hear the chime. Malric said nothing. He didn't lean forward or wave. He just let the silence grow. A man across the aisle leaned over, whispering to her, "Excuse me, I think he was missed." Cynthia turned her head slowly. Her voice had that carefully professional edge, the kind that didn't raise its tone, but somehow still cut. "There may have been a clerical error," she said. "He might not have been properly upgraded." Her words weren't loud, but the implication was clear. Enough passengers nearby heard to make the cabin go oddly quiet. Malric looked up. His voice was low and calm. "Would you like to verify that with the manifest?" Cynthia stared for half a beat too long. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. She turned without a word and stepped into the front galley. Malric exhaled through his nose. His hand trembled, barely visible, resting on his thigh. It wasn't anger. It was pressure, the kind that builds over time, like heat under metal. He remembered sitting in another seat years ago, different airline, same dynamic. Back then, he'd convinced himself it was just that person, just that flight. Now he knew better. This wasn't about isolated moments. It was about a system that didn't blink when it overlooked him. He wasn't asking for more than anyone else. Just the same. A ping from his phone. Alden again. Behavior tag marked, watch level raised, social media picking it up. 2 tweets from row 4. Malric didn't respond immediately. He just stared at the tray table, then out the window. Clouds thick and low, nothing but gray ahead. He tapped a few words back. "Let it grow." A few minutes later, a woman from across the aisle stood and walked toward the galley. When she returned, she carried 2 bottles of water, one for herself and one she placed gently on Malric's tray. "I figured you could use this," she said softly. "This doesn't feel right." He looked up. Her eyes were kind. Not sorry for him, just aware. Aware in the way people sometimes are when something finally clicks, when they start to see the edges of a world that's always been there. "Thank you," Malric replied. His voice was steady, but the words carried weight. As she sat back down, Cynthia emerged from the galley. Her face was composed, but something had shifted in her eyes, a flicker of uncertainty. She paused for a moment as if considering what to say, but the moment passed, and she continued her routine like nothing had happened. Passengers whispered, nothing loud, just enough to feel it. Malric glanced toward Alden, who met his gaze briefly and nodded. No need for words between them. He took the water bottle, unscrewed the cap, and drank slowly. Every move was measured, not for show, but for himself. It was his way of grounding, of staying in the moment. He thought about the faces he'd seen over the years, colleagues, mentors, strangers, who told him to keep his head down, stay quiet, earn their respect. But the truth was, no matter how many degrees, dollars, or decades he carried, someone always found a way to question his place. And still, here he was, not shouting, not making a scene, just sitting in his seat, being here, refusing to be invisible. Malric sat quiet, but his thoughts moved like a current under still water. The interaction with Cynthia hadn't ended. It was stretching out in silence like an itch just below the skin. Her refusal, the look in her eyes, it hadn't come from nowhere. It came from something practiced, familiar. This wasn't her first time dismissing someone like him, and that mattered. The overhead lights dimmed slightly as the flight attendants prepared for the second half of service. Cynthia passed by once again, eyes forward, but her pace was slower now. She knew something had shifted. It wasn't just Malric. It was the energy around him. A quiet tension had settled into the cabin, like the feeling when you realize a room has gotten too still. Malric leaned back, feeling the weight of what came next pressing on his chest. His phone buzzed in his coat pocket. Alden. GA81 alert escalated. Cynthia flagged. You want me to make a call? Malric stared at the message for a moment, thumb hovering over the screen. Then he typed, slowly, deliberately, not yet. Let her finish her shift. He slipped the phone back in and folded his hands together. His pulse had slowed, but his mind wasn't resting. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep playing the role of silent observer. That was never the long-term plan. It was just the first move. When they'd started this initiative, watching from within, Alden had warned him, "You might not like what you see, but you need to see it." He'd nodded then, thinking he could handle it. But this wasn't some abstract business strategy or operations test. This was personal. And sitting here, being treated like a problem in the system he'd helped build, was bringing something to the surface he hadn't felt in years. Shame, number anger, a little, but more than anything, it was responsibility. Linda, the woman who had brought him the water, was reading a book now, glancing up from time to time, her expression thoughtful. Other passengers looked forward, some pretending to sleep, but you could feel it in their bodies. Shoulders slightly turned toward him, ears tuned for what might come next. Cynthia stepped out of the galley once more, but this time her eyes swept the cabin. Something was different in her face, a tightness around the mouth. She was starting to realize she'd missed something important. Something or someone. She glanced at Malric, brief but direct, and for the first time her expression broke. Confusion, maybe concern. Her eyes flicked to the lapel of his blazer, then to the watch on his wrist. She was adding things up, and the math wasn't working in her favor. Malric didn't move. He just looked back. Not with hostility, not with pride, just with the steady gaze of someone who knew exactly who he was and who had stopped trying to convince anyone else. Then without looking away, he reached into his carry-on, pulled out a blazer, the one he wore when signing the shareholder agreement last fall, and slipped it on. It wasn't loud, it wasn't theatrical, but it was deliberate. The pin on the collar sparkled under the cabin lights. Solaris Executive Crest, gold and blue. Cynthia saw it. She froze, just for a second. But it was enough. She turned quickly, heading back toward the front of the cabin. Her walk no longer had the same controlled grace. There was a hesitation in her steps now, a stiffness. Malric let out a quiet breath. A few moments later, a voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be starting our descent shortly. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts." The timing was perfect. As the plane began its slow drop into New York airspace, Malric reached for his phone again and typed, "Prepare for post-landing review. I'll address the cabin after touchdown." Alden replied almost instantly, "You're sure?" Malric stared out the window at the skyline slowly forming through the clouds. His reflection stared back, older now, but steady. "Yeah," he replied. "It's time." The wheels hit the tarmac with a thud that rattled slightly beneath Malric's seat. Outside, the sky over New York was pale and hazy, with long shadows stretching across the runway. Inside the cabin, the seatbelt signs blinked on, and passengers stirred from their thoughts, loosening belts and reaching for bags. But no one stood. The captain's voice came on, calm and direct. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We have company representatives boarding for an operational check before deplaning." It wasn't standard, and everyone knew it. Cynthia stood frozen near the galley, her hand resting on the jump seat. She didn't look back toward Malric, but her body betrayed her. Rigid posture, fingers tapping against her side, jaw tight. The calm she'd held all flight was slipping. Malric stayed seated, his blazer still buttoned, the crest on his lapel now fully visible. The room had shifted hours ago, but now the balance of power was tangible, and not because he'd forced it, because he had waited. 2 minutes later, the forward door opened with a click and a hiss. A tall man in a steel-gray suit stepped aboard. Elric Thane, Vice President of Operations. His presence didn't scream authority, but it hummed with it. Behind him, 2 Solaris staff followed, their badges clipped high and visible. He didn't address the passengers at first. He walked straight to Malric, extending a hand. "Mr. Dorsey, we're ready when you are." A ripple moved through the cabin. Some leaned forward, others shifted in their seats. One man murmured something to his wife. A few phones quietly lifted, not filming, just held, like people knew something was about to happen, but weren't sure what. Malric stood slow and steady. He turned, looking out over the cabin, his eyes moving from face to face. No judgment, no grand emotion, just awareness. He spoke simply. "I came here today as a passenger, no press, no announcement, just a man in a seat. And what I saw confirmed why I bought into this company." He paused, letting that settle. No raised voice, just steady air in the room. I wanted to see who we are when no one's watching. Cynthia's breathing grew uneven. Elric turned toward her, giving a small nod to one of his assistants. The man approached her, professional and quiet. Ms. Greaves, we need to speak with you off board. Her eyes flicked from Malric to the assistant, then to the passengers still watching. Her voice, when it came, was barely more than a whisper. I didn't know. Malric answered her, but his tone held no sharp edge. That's the problem. He didn't gloat. He didn't humiliate. But his words carried more weight than any punishment could. As Cynthia stepped off the plane, head lowered, Malric watched her go. Not with anger, with responsibility. He had asked for the truth, and now he had it, raw and uncomfortable. Not just her actions, but the system that allowed them to go unchecked. He turned back to the cabin. This company isn't changing because of headlines or lawsuits. It's changing because it has to. Because if we don't face the truth about how we treat people, every person, we don't deserve their trust. A man in row 2 nodded, his hand resting on his heart. Linda smiled, soft and proud. A young attendant near the back looked down at her hands, then slowly raised her eyes to meet his. Malric exhaled, not in relief but in readiness. He'd spent a lifetime being told to wait his turn, prove himself, stay quiet. But now, in this moment, he wasn't waiting anymore. The debrief room at LaGuardia wasn't fancy. 4 beige walls, a long oak table, and a wide window facing the runway. The kind of place where decisions were made behind closed doors, far from the public's eyes. Malric sat at one end, arms relaxed, blazer unbuttoned now, but his presence filled the space like a quiet storm. Across from him, Elric Thane was flipping through the GA81 report, the digital tablet lighting his face. He scrolled slowly, pausing at flagged moments, shaking his head. She didn't just mishandle service, Elric said, tapping the screen. She skipped protocol, dismissed a priority guest, and doubled down after being notified. Twice. Alden, sitting near the window, added calmly, she didn't see the alert on her tablet because she wasn't looking. She was operating on something else entirely. Malric didn't respond right away. He just looked down at his hands. Thick, strong fingers, weathered like they'd been used more for building than pointing. She wasn't alone in it, he finally said. That was just the moment. The habit behind it runs deeper. The room went still. For a long time, Malric had tried to believe this kind of thing was fading, that progress wasn't just surface deep, but every now and then, something like this stripped the pain away and showed what was underneath. She's not the only one, Alden added, pulling up a parallel report. 12 other incidents flagged in the last quarter. All first class, all same profile. Malric closed his eyes briefly. His voice stayed even. If we fire her, someone else takes her place with the same attitude, same training, same blind spots. Elric raised a brow. So what are you thinking? Malric leaned forward, not with intensity but clarity. I want her in the first cohort of the retraining program, not hidden, not quietly reassigned. I want her front and center. If she's willing to stay and face it, she can. Alden looked surprised, just slightly. You're sure? Yeah, Malric said. She needs to be part of the repair. If we keep kicking people out without showing them the cracks they helped build, we're not fixing the structure. We're just repainting it. The door opened softly and Cynthia stepped in. She looked different now. No scarf, no uniform jacket, no badge. Just a plain blue shirt, sleeves rolled up, hands clasped in front of her. Her posture was stiff, her eyes heavy. She looked like someone who hadn't slept, and maybe hadn't stopped thinking since the moment she stepped off the plane. No one said anything for a moment. Finally, she broke the silence. Her voice was dry, but there was no defensiveness in it. I didn't think it would matter. Malric nodded once. It always matters. She looked straight at him and something broke in her voice. I've worked 20 years trying to be respected on these flights. The way I dress, the way I speak, every little thing. And then you came on and she stopped herself. Malric didn't flinch. And I reminded you what they never let you be. Tears didn't fall, but they shimmered. I thought I had to act a certain way to survive in that job. I thought that meant keeping control, deciding who fit, who didn't. She swallowed hard. I forgot what it felt like to be the one on the outside. Malric folded his hands. You're not being terminated, he said gently but firmly. You're being invited. If you want to stay, you'll learn. Unlearn. And maybe one day, teach someone else how not to do what you did. Her chin trembled. I do want to stay. Alden stood and offered her a folder. Orientation starts Monday. As she took it, her fingers brushed the table. She paused and then whispered, Thank you. When she left the room, silence settled again, but it wasn't heavy. It felt like the end of a storm. Elric turned to Malric. That was bold. Malric smiled faintly. No one changes by being thrown out. They change when someone holds up a mirror and waits. It was almost sunset when Malric stepped outside. The light touched everything with a soft golden hue, casting long shadows across the pavement at the edge of the Solaris training campus. He stood there a moment, letting the air settle on his face. The day had been long, but not heavy, just full. Inside, Cynthia had taken her seat in the front row of the re-education program. No uniform, no title pinned to her shirt. Just her name on a simple tag, the same as everyone else. She didn't speak much during the session, but she didn't look away either. She listened, really listened. Malric had watched from the back of the room, not to monitor her, not to intimidate, just to be present, to show that change wasn't something he was delegating, it was something he was owning. He still remembered the look on her face when she'd asked to stay. It wasn't desperation, it was recognition, the realization that the world she thought she was protecting wasn't real, not anymore. He made his way through the glass doors into a quieter side of the building, where Alden waited by a table stacked with printed orientation guides and bottled water. Alden looked up with a small grin. She didn't flinch today, he said. She's not the same person that stepped off that plane, Malric replied, and she probably won't be the same tomorrow either. Alden nodded. That's the point. They stood in silence for a moment. Behind them, a group of young new hires walked past, diverse, energetic, their laughter echoing lightly through the hallway. Malric watched them go, eyes steady. They won't remember our names, he said, but they'll feel the difference in the room. That's enough. Alden chuckled under his breath. Speak for yourself. I'm still trying to get a conference room named after me. Malric smiled, but it faded gently into something more thoughtful. I used to think power was about being heard, he said. Then I thought it was about being in the room where things happen. But I'm learning sometimes power is just having the patience to let someone else change before you shut the door. That hit Alden in the chest. He didn't say anything, just gave a small nod and looked down at his hands. Malric moved toward the exit. He was tired but not worn out. There was still more to do, but for now the first stone had been laid. As he stepped outside, a voice called from across the parking lot. Mr. Dorsey? He turned to see a young man, maybe in his late 20s, jogging over in a Solaris employee vest. He looked a little nervous but determined. I just wanted to say what you did. It meant something, the young man said. I've been working ground crew here for a year. My uncle told me stories like yours, but I never thought I'd see someone do something about it. Not like that. Malric looked him in the eyes, steady and warm. Keep showing up, he said, even when they look past you, especially then. The young man nodded, then smiled before walking back toward the loading bay. Malric stood still for a moment, letting the weight of the day roll off his shoulders. Not completely gone, but lighter now. When he finally got into his car, he didn't start the engine right away. He sat there, hands on the wheel, watching the training building fade into dusk. He wasn't trying to win anymore. He was building something, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like it might last. The press release dropped at exactly 9 a.m. the following Monday. Solaris Air had issued company-wide announcements before, but never like this. Never with this kind of language. Effective immediately, it read, Solaris Air is implementing a comprehensive service culture reset across all flight operations, beginning with our Equity First initiative, led by co-owner Malric Dorsey. It wasn't dressed up in PR jargon. It was direct, honest. It named the problem and laid out the response. No dodging, no spin. Malric read it once, then closed the tab on his laptop and stepped out onto the porch. His coffee sat untouched on the rail, steam curling into the cool Georgia morning. He hadn't planned to say anything to the media, but he'd agreed to one thing: a sit-down with the internal team, recorded for staff-only distribution. The interviewer had asked him what triggered the shift. Malrick paused, then said, "It wasn't one big thing. It was the small ones. The moments that go unnoticed until they don't." He looked down at his hands now. They were still, strong, the kind of hands that had built things over time, carefully, quietly, sometimes without credit. Behind him, a notification buzzed on his phone. It was a message from Linda, the woman from the flight who had given him the bottle of water. She'd found his email through the company site. "I didn't know who you were. I didn't need to. I just knew you were being treated unfairly." That shouldn't be remarkable, but I guess it still is. "Thank you for not letting it slide." Malrick smiled softly. He'd replied to her the night after the flight, short and sincere. "Kindness is louder than we think. Sometimes it echoes long after the moment ends." At Solaris headquarters, Cynthia sat in a quiet classroom with 20 others, some new hires, some longtime employees. They were working through the first module of the re-education program. Not just policy, but mindset. What it meant to serve with dignity. What it meant to assume respect, not demand it. She wasn't the only one who looked uncomfortable, but she showed up early that day, and she didn't look away when the screen displayed the footage from that flight. The moment she ignored a passenger, the moment she dismissed a request that should have been as simple as water. When asked what she saw in the video, she spoke clearly. "I saw myself," she said, "and I didn't like it." No one clapped, no one needed to. They just nodded. Malrick sat with Alden later that afternoon in a small conference room with a view of the airfield. Outside, crews moved carts and baggage. Planes lined the gates. Attendants stepped onto jet bridges. "You think this'll hold?" Alden asked. Malrick leaned back, watching the runway. "Change doesn't happen because of policy. It happens because people decide to see what they were trained not to." He paused, then added, "We're not fixing hearts in a week, but we're giving people a reason to check their own." Alden gave a slow nod. "It feels different now." "It is," Malrick said, "not just because of what we're doing, but because of how we're doing it." That night, as he left the office, a young woman in uniform held the door open for him. "Evening, Mr. Dorsey," she said with a kind smile. He nodded back, returning the smile. "Evening. Keep going." He didn't need a plaque or a press conference. He didn't need headlines or applause. He needed the culture to feel different, and now it finally did. Sometimes the loudest message comes from someone who chooses not to raise their voice. Malrick Dorsey didn't need to argue, threaten, or explain. He simply showed up, watched, and waited until the truth revealed itself. This story isn't just about one flight. It's about what we choose to see and what we choose to ignore. So what would you have done in that cabin? And more importantly, how would you want to be treated? If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful, real-life inspired stories just like this.